On the first day of third grade, 8-year-old Lucas Mitchell hunched low in his seat, trying to disappear as Ms. Crawford's voice cut through the classroom like ice, pointing out that he was the only student who hadn't brought the required supplies from the extensive list sent to parents over the summer. Tears welled in his eyes as the teacher continued her public scolding, unaware that his single mother had been laid off just weeks before school started, forcing them to choose between electricity for their apartment or the brand-new backpack and perfectly sharpened pencils that now seemed like an impossible luxury. If you love stories about unexpected kindness and the powerful moments when children teach adults the true meaning of compassion, please subscribe to our channel now so you never miss another tale that reminds us of the extraordinary impact small actions can have on those struggling silently among us. As the other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances that reflected a growing sense of injustice, no one could have predicted how this humiliating moment would transform not just Lucas's school year, but the entire classroom culture Mrs. Crawford had so carefully established through her rigid expectations and unforgiving standards. That morning had started with such hope. Lucas had woken early, too excited about his first day of third grade to sleep. He'd carefully laid out his cleanest clothes the night before, a blue t-shirt that was slightly faded but free of holes, and jeans that Elena had patched at the knee with fabric from an old shirt. His sneakers were from last year and a little tight, but he'd polished them with a damp cloth until they looked almost new. "You look so handsome," Elena had said, her smile not quite hiding the worry in her eyes as she'd straightened his collar. "My big third grader." Lucas had beamed at her praise, but his smile had faltered when he noticed her glancing at the empty spot by the door where a new backpack should have been. "I'm sorry, mijo," Elena had whispered, kneeling to his level. "After the rent and the electric bill. I promise as soon as I get my first paycheck from the diner." "It's okay, Mom," Lucas had interrupted, wrapping his thin arms around her neck. "Ms. Jackson always said I was good at sharing. I bet someone will let me borrow a pencil." Now, sitting at his assigned desk in Ms. Crawford's immaculate classroom, that confidence had evaporated. The teacher stood at the front, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp eyes surveying the room from behind rectangular glasses that matched her perfectly pressed pantsuit. "When I call your name," Ms. Crawford announced, "please hold up your supply box so I can verify you have everything on the list." Her voice was crisp, each word precisely enunciated. "This helps me identify responsible students who follow directions." One by one, she called out names from her clipboard. One by one, children proudly displayed colorful pencil cases and supply boxes filled with markers, scissors, glue sticks, and all the other items from the 2-page supply list that had been mailed to homes over the summer. Lucas Mitchell. Lucas froze, his empty desk seeming to expand around him, showcasing his lack of preparation. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Lucas Mitchell," Ms. Crawford repeated, an edge creeping into her voice. "Your supplies, please." I don't have them yet," Lucas managed, his voice barely audible. Ms. Crawford set down her clipboard, folding her arms across her chest. "I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Please speak up so the class can hear you." Lucas felt his face burning as 23 pairs of eyes turned toward him. "I don't have my supplies yet," he repeated, slightly louder. "None of them? Not a single pencil? Not the supply box? Not even the hand sanitizer?" Each question landed like a stone, heavy and painful. The list was sent out in June, Lucas. That's 2 entire months to prepare. Across the room, Zoe Anderson watched Lucas shrink into his chair. Her own desk was meticulously organized with color-coded folders and a pencil case monogrammed with her initials, gifts from her father, who owned the largest real estate company in town. Something about Lucas's expression reminded her of her little brother when he'd fallen off his bike last year, that same combination of pain and embarrassment. 2 seats away, Tyler Rodriguez slouched in his chair, absently spinning a fidget toy between his fingers. Unlike most students who looked uncomfortable or fascinated by Lucas's public shaming, Tyler's expression was hard, almost angry. He'd been in Lucas's position more times than he could count. The kid singled out, the one who didn't quite fit the mold. In the back corner, Amina Hassan kept her eyes down, focusing intensely on her perfectly aligned pencils. Having arrived from Somalia just 18 months ago, she was still adjusting to American school culture, but some things were universal. The sting of public humiliation, the heavy weight of poverty. Her father had worked 3 jobs to afford her supplies, understanding instinctively how important it was for her to blend in, to not give anyone another reason to see her as different. Well, Ms. Crawford continued, the silence having stretched painfully long, I suppose this gives us an excellent opportunity to discuss the importance of responsibility and preparation. She turned to the whiteboard, writing preparation in large blue letters. Can anyone tell me why coming prepared is important? Hands shot up around the room, students eager to distance themselves from Lucas's mistake. Mrs. Crawford called on a girl in the front row with neatly braided hair. Because it shows respect for the teacher in the class, the girl answered promptly. Excellent. Megan, anyone else? Because you can't do your work without the right tools, offered another student. Mrs. Crawford nodded approvingly. Precisely, Jackson. You see, Lucas, when you come to school unprepared, you're not just letting yourself down. You're disrespecting our classroom community and setting yourself up for failure. Lucas stared hard at his desktop, willing the tears not to fall. He knew his mom had tried. He'd seen her at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by bills, marked "Final Notice" in angry red letters. He'd heard her muffled crying from behind her bedroom door after she thought he was asleep. Since you don't have supplies, Ms. Crawford continued, you'll need to take particularly good notes on our whiteboard work today. I'll loan you 1 pencil. Please return it at the end of the day. I expect you to have your supplies by tomorrow. Tupcornode placed a single yellow pencil on Lucas's desk before continuing with her checklist. The pencil was perfectly sharpened, its clean yellow surface unmarred by teeth marks or wear. Somehow, this made Lucas feel worse, the pristine tool highlighting his own inadequacy. As Mrs. Crawford moved on to reviewing classroom rules, Lucas heard a soft sound to his right. Glancing over, he saw Zoe looking at him, a small, sympathetic smile on her face. She mouthed something that looked like, "It's okay," before turning her attention back to the teacher. Across the room, Tyler had stopped spinning his fidget toy, his dark eyes fixed on Ms. Crawford with an expression that might have worried the teacher had she noticed it. And in the back, Amina slowly tore a page from her new notebook, folding it carefully and slipping it into her pocket, an idea already forming in her mind. When the bell rang for morning recess, Lucas remained seated while the other children rushed toward the door. Mrs. Crawford called after them to line up properly, but her reminder lacked its usual authority, as if the enthusiasm of 23 children escaping her classroom had momentarily overwhelmed her control. "Lucas," she said, turning her attention back to him once the room had emptied, "I expect you to take this seriously. Bring your supplies tomorrow." Lucas nodded mutely, still unable to meet her eyes. He didn't know how to explain that tomorrow. Wouldn't be any different, that the same empty cupboards and stack of bills would be waiting at home, that his mother's pride would still prevent her from asking for help, that the weight of their struggles would still be too heavy for his 8-year-old shoulders to carry alone. What Lucas couldn't know, as he finally slipped out of the classroom toward the playground, was that the seeds of change had already been planted, not by Ms. Crawford's harsh lesson on responsibility, but by the quiet observations of 3 classmates who saw in his humiliation a call to action that would ultimately transform their entire class. Elena Mitchell's feet ached as she carried plates of pancakes and eggs to table 7 at Sunshine Diner. 6 hours into her shift, the worn soles of her waitressing shoes provided little cushion against the hard tile floor. But Elena kept a smile. Fixed on her face, Sunny disposition was listed as a requirement in the job description, and she couldn't afford to lose this position. Not when it was the only thing standing between her and Lucas and complete financial collapse. "Can I get you folks anything else?" she asked the elderly couple at the table, topping off their coffee cups without waiting for a response. Small courtesies like that often improved tips, and every extra dollar mattered now. "We're fine, dear," the woman replied kindly. "These pancakes are delicious." Elena nodded appreciatively before moving to her next table, glancing at the clock as she walked. 2:15 p.m. Lucas would be getting out of school in about an hour. Normally, he would go to the after-school program until she could pick him up after her shift ended, but that was before Westbrook Technologies had restructured, eliminating her administrative position along with 20 others. Before their savings had dwindled to nothing over 2 months of unemployment. Before she'd had to choose between buying school supplies and keeping the electricity on. "Order up for table 4, called Jerry, the short order cook, sliding a plate across the counter. Elena grabbed the order, her mind still on Lucas. His first day of 3rd grade, and she'd sent him to school empty-handed. The shame of it burned in her chest. What kind of mother couldn't provide her child with basic school supplies? The memory of his brave little face that morning, trying so hard to hide his disappointment, made her throat tighten painfully. "Elena, you're wanted on the phone," called Margot, the hostess, from the front desk. "Says it's about your son." Elena's heart dropped. Setting down the plate she was carrying, she hurried to the phone, a dozen worst-case scenarios flashing through her mind. "Hello, this is Elena Mitchell," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Barbara Jenkins, the school counselor at Pinewood Elementary." The woman's voice was professionally calm, which somehow made Elena more anxious. "I'm calling about Lucas. There's been an incident in class today." "Is he hurt?" Elena asked immediately, gripping the counter. No, nothing like that," the counselor assured her. "But he became quite upset during morning check-in. His teacher, Ms. Crawford, noted that he didn't have any of his school supplies, and the situation became, well, Lucas was quite embarrassed." Elena closed her eyes, imagining her sensitive son being singled out. "Is he okay now?" "He's calmed down, yes, I spoke with him briefly, but he didn't want to discuss it much." Mrs. Crawford suggested we schedule a meeting to discuss the situation and find a solution. The word solution hung in the air like an accusation, as if Lucas's lack of supplies was a behavioral problem rather than the result of financial desperation. "I'm working right now," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice professional. "I can't leave in the middle of my shift." "Of course, I understand," the counselor replied, though her tone suggested she didn't. Not really. "Perhaps tomorrow after school. Ms. Crawford is very concerned about Lucas starting the year without proper materials." Elena bit back the words she wanted to say, that if Mrs. Crawford was so concerned, perhaps she could have pulled Lucas aside privately instead of humiliating him in front of his peers. Instead, she agreed to a meeting the following afternoon and hung up, her hand shaking slightly. "Everything okay with the kid?" asked Margot, who had been pretending not to listen. "Just a misunderstanding," Elena replied automatically, the same answer she'd been giving for weeks whenever anyone noticed the strain showing on her face. "I should get back to my tables." As she returned to work, Elena mentally calculated how many shifts it would take to afford the school supplies. The list had seemed endless. Specific brands of markers and colored pencils, special notebooks, folders in particular colors, headphones for the computer lab, tissues for the classroom, disinfecting wipes, hand sanitizer. The total at the store had been just over $70, an amount that might as well have been $700, given their current situation. During her break, Elena sat in the back booth reserved for staff and pulled out her phone. She still had 15 minutes, enough time to make a few calls. First, she tried the local Community Action Center, only to be told their school supply program had ended the previous week. Next was the St. Vincent de Paul Society at her church, but They had already distributed all their backpacks for the year. "Have you tried the Family Resource Center at the school?" asked the church volunteer. "I didn't know there was one," Elena admitted. "Most schools have some resources for families in need. They're usually pretty discreet about it." After thanking the volunteer, Elena immediately called the school back, this time asking for the Family Resource Center. She was transferred to a voicemail and left a message explaining their situation, her voice catching as she forced herself to say the words out loud. Recently laid off, struggling financially, unable to afford school supplies. The admission felt like failure. Each word another crack in the armor of independence she'd fought so hard to maintain since Lucas's father had walked out 6 years ago. When her break ended, Elena returned to the floor with renewed determination. She would pick up extra shifts. She would find a way to get Lucas what he needed. She'd skipped lunch today. She could do that again tomorrow, save the money she would have spent. Maybe she could sell something. Though looking around their small apartment, she knew there wasn't much left of value. She'd already pawned her wedding ring months ago to cover the security deposit when they'd had to downsize to a cheaper place. "You look like you're plotting world domination over there," commented Darlene, another waitress, as they refilled salt shakers at the side station. Elena managed a small laugh. "It just trying to figure some things out for Lucas." Darlene, a grandmother of 4 with a kind face lined by years of hard work, studied Elena knowingly. "Kid troubles? School supplies," Elena admitted. "Lost my job at Westbrook 2 months ago. Been trying to find the money, but..." Darlene nodded, no judgment in her expression. "My daughter went through something similar last year. You know, I might have some things left over from my grandson. He's in 5th grade now, but there might be a backpack, some notebooks. Nothing fancy, but better than nothing." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "That would be... I could pay you back once I..." "Don't you dare," Darlene interrupted firmly. "That's not how this works. We help each other when we can. I'll bring what I have tomorrow." For the first time that day, Elena felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't a solution. The backpack would probably be worn, the supplies incomplete, but it was something. A start. As her shift wound down, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Alvarez, their elderly neighbor who watched Lucas after school until Elena could get home. "Lucas is here. Very quiet today. Didn't want snack. Homework?" Elena's heart sank. Lucas loved Mrs. Alvarez's homemade cookies. If he was refusing snacks and not talking, the day had been even worse than she'd feared. She quickly texted back that she'd be home by 6, then slipped the phone back into her apron pocket. 3 more hours. 3 more hours of smiling at customers, of ignoring her aching feet and back, of calculating tips and mentally allocating. Each dollar. This much for the electric bill, this much for groceries, this much saved toward Lucas's supplies. 3 more hours until she could hold her son and try to undo the damage of the day, though she suspected some wounds couldn't be healed with just a mother's embrace. As she delivered the check to the elderly couple at table 7, the woman pressed something into Elena's hand along with the payment. "A little extra," she whispered. "You remind me of my daughter when she was starting out. Hang in there, honey." Elena looked down to see a $20 tip on a $30 bill. Generosity she hadn't expected and couldn't afford to refuse. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Perhaps tomorrow would be better. Perhaps the Family Resource Center would call back. Perhaps Lucas would find friends who didn't care about new backpacks or perfect supplies. Perhaps. The word that had become her prayer and her curse, the thin thread of hope she clung to as she navigated their new reality one careful step at a time. Recess at Pinewood Elementary School was typically a chaotic symphony of shouting, laughter, and the rhythmic bouncing of balls against pavement. Children scattered across the playground like marbles spilled from a jar, each finding their own space in the complex social ecosystem that existed outside classroom walls. Lucas sat alone on a bench at the edge of the playground, the borrowed pencil clutched in his hand like a talisman. He'd contemplated hiding in the bathroom until recess ended, but feared that would only draw more attention when Mrs. Crawford inevitably sent someone to find him. So instead, he'd chosen this spot, visible enough to avoid questions but far enough from the main activity to minimize interaction. Across the playground, Zoe Anderson stood with a group of girls playing double dutch, her golden ponytail bouncing as she counted the rhythm. But her attention kept drifting to the solitary figure on the bench. Twice she'd missed her jump, earning playful mockery from her friends. "Earth to Zoe," called Megan, the girl with neat braids who had answered Mrs. Crawford's question about preparation. "It's your turn again. I'll be right back," Zoe said suddenly, stepping away from the jump rope circle. "Where are you going?" Megan asked, following Zoe's gaze toward Lucas. "Oh, him? Seriously?" Zoe hesitated, caught between her social standing and the uncomfortable feeling that had been growing in her chest since morning. "I just want to check if he's okay." Megan rolled her eyes. "Whatever. But if Ms. Crawford sees you, she's going to think you're encouraging his irresponsibility or something." Zoe walked away without responding, though Megan's words had struck a nerve. Mrs. Crawford had clear ideas about which students were good influences and which weren't. Being seen as the former came with privileges that Zoe had always enjoyed. Leading the line, distributing materials, being trusted with classroom tasks. Risking that status wasn't something she took lightly. As she approached Lucas, she noticed how tightly he was holding the pencil, his knuckles almost white with the effort. Closer now, she could see that his eyes were still red-rimmed from earlier, though no fresh tears fell. "Hi," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I'm Zoe." Lucas glanced up, then quickly back down at the ground. "I know," he mumbled. Everyone knew Zoe Anderson. Her dad's company logo was on half the for sale signs in town, and she'd been elected class president in both first and second grade. "Can I sit?" Zoe asked, gesturing to the empty space beside him. Lucas shrugged, which Zoe took as permission. She sat, smoothing her skirt underneath her, a habit her mother had instilled through countless reminders about ladylike behavior. For a moment, neither spoke. Lucas focused intently on a colony of ants traversing the concrete near his feet, while Zoe tried to think of something to say that wouldn't sound condescending or make things worse. "Ms. Crawford can be really strict," she finally offered. Last year, she made Jason Miller stay in at recess for a whole week because he forgot his homework folder twice. Lucas didn't respond, but his grip on the pencil loosened slightly. "Anyway," Zoe continued, reaching into her pocket, "I have an extras, pencil, and a little notebook. You can have them if you want." She placed both items on the bench between them. A purple mechanical pencil with a unicorn eraser top and a small spiral notebook with a glittery cover. Lucas stared at the offerings, conflicting emotions crossing his face. "I don't need your charity," he said quietly, though without much conviction. "It's not charity," Zoe replied, having anticipated this response. Her mother often used that word when discussing her father's donations to various causes. "It's just, I have too many. My dad always buys extra of everything." Still, Lucas hesitated. "The pencil is purple, and it has a unicorn." Zoe bit her lip, realizing she hadn't considered that an 8-year-old boy might not want such feminine school supplies. "I have others at home. I could bring a different one tomorrow." Lucas finally looked at her directly. "Why are you doing this?" The question caught Zoe off guard with its directness. Why was she doing this? Partly because of the uncomfortable feeling she'd experienced watching his humiliation. Partly because of how her father always talked about Andersons stepping up when others are in need. Partly because something in Lucas's defeated posture reminded her of herself on the days when her parents' fighting grew too loud to ignore. "Because I want to," she said simply. "And because Ms. Crawford shouldn't have embarrassed you like that." From across the playground, Tyler Rodriguez watched the interaction with narrowed eyes. He'd been half-heartedly shooting baskets with some of the other boys, but his attention had been focused on Lucas since they'd come outside. Now, seeing Zoe, Princess Perfect Zoe, with her designer clothes and never-ending supply of everything, swooping in like some fairy godmother, he felt a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Yo, Tyler!" "The ball!" shouted one of his teammates, jarring him back to the game. Tyler caught the basketball on reflex, but instead of taking the shot, he tucked it under his arm and started walking toward the bench where Lucas and Zoe sat. "Where are you going?" called Jackson, the boy who had answered Mrs. Crawford's question about needing the right tools. Tyler ignored him, continuing his determined path across the playground. He wasn't entirely sure what he planned to say or do when he reached Lucas. And Zoe, unlike Zoe, he didn't have extra supplies to offer. Unlike Zoe, he didn't have the social capital to make. Befriending the class outcast seemed like a noble gesture rather than a step down the social ladder. What he did have was an intimate understanding of shame, of standing out for all the wrong reasons, of teachers who decided who you were based on what you had or didn't have. As he approached, both Lucas and Zoe looked up, surprise evident on their faces. Tyler Rodriguez approaching voluntarily was an unusual enough event to warrant attention. With his reputation for behavioral issues and his tendency to keep to himself, Tyler wasn't someone who typically inserted himself into other people's business. "Hey," he said, the greeting coming out more gruffly than he'd intended. "Hi, Tyler," Zoe responded, her voice cautious, but not unwelcoming. Lucas said nothing, his expression guarded. He'd heard things about Tyler, that he'd been suspended last year for fighting, that he spent more time in the principal's office than in class, that the teachers watched him like they were just waiting for him to mess up. "Crawford's a jerk," Tyler said without preamble. What she did was messed up. Lucas blinked, clearly not expecting this assessment. Zoe looked equally startled by Tyler's bluntness. "My mom says we shouldn't call teachers names," she said automatically, then immediately regretted it when Tyler's expression hardened. "Your mom doesn't have Crawford breathing down her neck every time she moves," Tyler retorted. Then, turning back to Lucas, "Don't let her get to you. She does that to everyone she thinks she can push around." The warning bell rang, signaling 5 minutes until the end of recess. Children began reluctantly moving toward the lineup area, their games abandoned mid-play. "We should go," Zoe said, standing and brushing off her skirt. "Ms. Crawford hates when people are late to line up." Lucas nodded, rising from the bench. He hesitated, then picked up the purple pencil and notebook Zoe had offered, slipping them into his pocket. "Thanks," he said quietly. Zoe smiled, genuinely pleased. "You're welcome. I can bring more stuff tomorrow if you want." As they walked toward the lineup area, Tyler fell into step beside Lucas. He didn't speak again, but his presence on Lucas's left with Zoe on his right created a kind of buffer between the smaller boy and the rest of the playground. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious on Tyler's part, but not unnoticed by their classmates, who watched with curious eyes. Near the back of the forming line, Amina Hassan observed the trio's approach with interest. Unlike most of their peers, she saw the significance of what was happening. The popular girl, the troublemaker, and the poor kid walking together as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Such alliances were rare, but powerful. She'd seen similar dynamics in the refugee camp where her family had lived before coming to America. As Lucas took his place in line, Amina made her move. Stepping forward, she silently held out a sheet of paper, the one she'd torn from her notebook earlier. On it, she'd drawn a small cartoon of Ms. Crawford with an exaggeratedly stern face and ruler in hand. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Don't worry," written in careful English. Lucas took the paper, surprise giving way to a small smile, the first he'd shown all day. Around them, other students watched this exchange with growing curiosity. Something was happening, something that didn't follow the usual playground rules of who spoke to whom and who stood where in the complex hierarchy of third-grade social life. Mrs. Crawford, monitoring the line from the doorway, noticed the unusual grouping. Her eyes narrowed as she saw Lucas at the center of attention, Zoe Anderson and Tyler Rodriguez flanking him like unlikely bodyguards, Amina Hassan hovering nearby. "Straight line, everyone," she called sharply. "Hands to yourselves, eyes forward." "Wes." The children hurried to obey. Lucas quickly folded Amina's drawing and slipped it into his pocket alongside Zoe's pencil and notebook. Small treasures, unexpected lifelines in what had started as the worst first day of school imaginable. He didn't smile again as they filed back into the classroom, but something had shifted inside him, a tiny seed of reason. Lunch period arrived with the welcome relief of escape from Mrs. Crawford's classroom. As children filed into the cafeteria, the rigid seating arrangements of the classroom gave way to the more fluid social groupings that emerged during meal times. Established friend groups clustered together at tables, their unspoken boundaries as clear as if they'd been marked with warning signs. Zoe headed toward her usual table near the center of the cafeteria, where Megan and several other girls from their Double Dutch group were already unpacking colorful lunchboxes emblazoned with popular cartoon characters. She'd taken only a few steps when she spotted Lucas sitting alone at the end of a table near the wall, hunched over a brown paper bag. She hesitated, caught in the invisible tug-of-war between social expectation and the new connection she'd formed during recess. Sitting with Lucas would be a clear statement, one that wouldn't go unnoticed by her friends or by Ms. Crawford, who was on lunch duty today, patrolling the cafeteria with clipboard in hand. Before Zoe could decide, Tyler made the choice for her. With his usual disregard for social norms, he plopped his lunch tray down directly across from Lucas, the clatter drawing several curious glances. Lucas looked up, clearly startled by Tyler's appearance at his table. "This seat taken?" Tyler asked, though he was already settling in. Lucas shook his head, watching with cautious interest as Tyler examined the contents of his lunch tray. A rectangular piece of pizza, an apple, and a carton of chocolate milk. "School lunch is usually gross," Tyler commented, poking at the pizza suspiciously. "But pizza day isn't too bad." Across the cafeteria, Zoe felt Megan's questioning gaze. "Aren't you sitting with us?" Megan called, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Zoe glanced toward Mrs. Crawford, who was watching the exchange with narrowed eyes, then back at Lucas and Tyler. Making her decision, she veered away from her usual table and headed toward them. Instead, "I'll sit here today," she called back to Megan, whose eyebrows shot up in surprise. A ripple of whispers followed Zoe as she approached Lucas and Tyler's table. She set down her insulated lunch bag, monogrammed with her initials like most of her possessions, and took a seat beside Lucas. "Hi again," she said brightly, unzipping her lunch bag to reveal a container of pasta salad, a small bunch of grapes, and a homemade cookie wrapped in wax paper. Lucas mumbled a greeting, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were attracting. From his paper bag, he pulled out a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a paper towel and a slightly bruised apple. "That looks good," Zoe said, nodding toward his sandwich. "I love peanut butter." Lucas glanced at her elaborate lunch, then back at his simple sandwich. "My mom made it," he said, a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "Cool," Tyler interjected, before Zoe could respond. "My mom's always too busy in the morning. I have to get my own breakfast and stuff." This small confession that Tyler's home life might not match the carefully curated routines that many of their classmates experienced created a subtle shift in the dynamic. Lucas relaxed slightly, taking a bite of his sandwich at the edge of the cafeteria. Amina Hassan stood with her lunch tray, scanning the room with uncertain eyes. Normally, she sat with two other ESL students from different grades, but neither was in school today. Her gaze landed on Lucas, Zoe, and Tyler, and after a moment's hesitation, she began walking toward them. "May I sit?" she asked quietly, her accented English careful and precise. Zoe smiled warmly. Of course, Amina settled beside Tyler, arranging her lunch tray with methodical care. Unlike the others, she didn't immediately begin eating. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. "I have plan," she said, her voice low enough that only their table could hear. "For Lucas. For supplies." Tyler looked up from his pizza with newfound interest. What kind of plan? Amina glanced around, making sure Ms. Crawford wasn't within earshot. "Operation Backpack," she whispered, writing the words at the top of her AIM notebook page. "We help Lucas. Secret." Zoe leaned forward, intrigued. "Like a secret mission?" Amina nodded solemnly. "In my country, before America, my family had nothing. Other families helped. Small things from many people make big difference." Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "I don't need—" "Everyone needs help sometimes," Amina interrupted with unexpected firmness. No shame. The simplicity and conviction of her statement silenced Lucas's protest. Tyler nodded in agreement, a flash of respect in his eyes as he regarded Amina. "So what's the plan?" Zoe asked, excitement building in her voice. She'd never been part of a secret mission before. Her life typically unfolded in plain sight, under the watchful eyes of parents and teachers who monitored her every achievement. Amina began sketching in her notebook. Each person brings one thing. Small, hide in backpack or pocket. Give to Lucas quiet, no teachers see. She looked up. Ms. Crawford should not know. Would make Lucas feel bad again. On this point, they all agreed. Even Zoe, who typically believed in following rules and being transparent with adults, understood that Mrs. Crawford's involvement would only worsen the situation. "I can bring pencils and erasers," Zoe offered immediately, "and markers. I have tons." "I got notebooks at home," Tyler added. "My mom always buys extra when they're on sale." Amina nodded, making notes in her careful handwriting. "I bring glue sticks and scissors for my brother's supplies." They all looked at Lucas, who had remained silent during this planning session. His expression was a complex mixture of emotions: embarrassment at being the focus of their charity, relief at not facing Ms. Crawford's judgment alone tomorrow, and a cautious, growing warmth at having people who seemed to genuinely care about his situation. "Thank you," he said finally, the words barely audible over the cafeteria noise. Zoe beamed at him. "That's what friends are for." Friends. The word hung in the air between them, new and fragile and unexpected. None of them would have predicted at the beginning of the day that they would end up here, huddled together over lunch, planning a covert operation to help the boy Mrs. Crawford had humiliated. "We need more people," Amina said practically, tapping her pencil against the notebook. "Four not enough for all supplies." Tyler frowned. "We can't tell everyone. Someone will blab to Crawford." "What about just a few more kids?" Zoe suggested. "Like maybe Jackson? His dad's a doctor, so they have money for extra stuff," Tyler scoffed. "Jackson's a teacher's pet. He'd tell Crawford for sure." "What about Olivia?" Lucas ventured, speaking up for the first time. "She's nice. She smiled at me this morning when no one else did." Zoe considered this. "Olivia would help. She stood up for me last year when Madison was being mean about my new glasses." "And Kai," Amina added. "He understand hard times. His family came from Philippines last year." They continued discussing potential recruits, evaluating classmates based on trustworthiness and likelihood to have extra supplies. By the time the lunch period was ending, they had identified 5 additional students who might join their mission. How? "Do we ask them?" Lucas wondered as they gathered their lunch items. "We can't just walk up and say, 'Hey, want to give me your stuff?'" Zoe giggled at his phrasing, but Tyler nodded seriously. "We need to be cool about it. Make it seem like a secret club or something. Kids like that stuff." "Notes," Amina suggested, tearing pages from her notebook and quickly folding them into small squares. "I write. We give to people after school." As they stood to leave, Ms. Crawford approached their table, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. "Interesting lunch grouping today," she observed, her tone neutral, but her eyes sharp as they moved from face to face. "I don't believe I've seen the 4 of you together before." "We're friends," Zoe stated boldly, slipping one of Amina's folded notes into her pocket. "Right, guys?" Tyler nodded, his usual defiance tempered by a new protectiveness toward their fragile alliance. Amina murmured agreement, her eyes downcast in the presence of authority, and Lucas, gathering courage from the others, looked directly at Mrs. Crawford for the first time that day. "Yes," he said simply, "we're friends." Miss Crawford's expression remained unreadable as she surveyed the unlikely quartet. "Well," she said, finally, "friendship is important, but so is being on time for class. The bell rang 30 seconds ago." They hurried toward the exit, but not before exchanging glances that confirmed their shared purpose. Operation Backpack was officially underway, their first collective act of resistance against the system that had singled out Lucas for shame and judgment. As they filed back into the classroom, the plan gave Lucas something he hadn't felt since. Walking through the school doors that morning, hope. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe with these unexpected allies, he could face Mrs. Crawford and her supply checklist without the crushing weight of inadequacy pressing down on him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone after all. Margaret Crawford had been teaching third grade at Pinewood Elementary for 25 years. In that time, she had developed a reputation for running a tight ship. Her classroom was always orderly, her students performed well on standardized tests, and parents generally appreciated her no-nonsense approach to education. When former students saw her in the grocery store or at community events, they straightened their posture instinctively, a Pavlovian response to her authoritative presence. Alone in her classroom during her preparation period, Mrs. Crawford reviewed her notes from the morning. The first day always revealed so much about which students would thrive under her guidance and which would require additional structure. She had already identified several promising candidates for classroom responsibilities. Zoe Anderson, of course, who had excelled in both first and second grade. Jackson Patel, whose father was on the school board. Megan Williams, whose neat handwriting and attentive demeanor suggested a natural aptitude for organization. And then there was Lucas Mitchell. Ms. Crawford frowned as she made a notation beside his name. Coming unprepared on the first day was a red flag she couldn't ignore. In her experience, it often indicated a lack of parental involvement or a disregard for academic expectations. Either way, a challenge that needed to be addressed immediately, before poor habits became entrenched. The lunch period had brought another concerning development. Seeing Lucas with Zoe Anderson had been unexpected enough, but the addition of Tyler Rodriguez and Amina Hassan created a truly perplexing social combination. Tyler's behavioral issues were well documented in his school file, which Mrs. Crawford had reviewed carefully before the start of the year. And while Amina seemed diligent, her limited English proficiency made her an odd companion for Zoe, who typically gravitated toward high-achieving peers. A knock at the classroom door interrupted her thoughts. Jean Thompson, the fourth-grade teacher whose classroom was across the hall, poked her head in. "Got a minute, Margaret?" she asked, already stepping into the room. Jean was one of the few colleagues Mrs. Crawford considered a friend. They had started at Pinewood the same year and shared similar views on educational standards and discipline. "Of course," Ms. Crawford replied, setting down her pen. "How's your new class?" Jeanne sighed dramatically, pulling up a student chair that looked comically small beneath her tall frame. The usual mixed bag, a few bright ones, a few troublemakers, and a whole lot in between. She leaned forward conspirationally. "But I hear you've got Elena Mitchell's boy this year?" Ms. Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lucas Mitchell, yes. How do you know Elena?" "I don't, not personally," Jean clarified, "but Karen in the office mentioned she called the Family Resource Center this morning. Apparently, she lost her job at Westbrook, that big tech company that had layoffs back in June. Single mom, struggling to make ends meet. Explains why the boy showed up without supplies." This information cast the morning's events in a new light. Mrs. Crawford had assumed negligence, not financial hardship. Still, she maintained that her approach had been appropriate. Regardless of personal circumstances, There are expectations, she said firmly. The supply list was sent out months ago, and the school has resources for families in need. She should have reached out before the first day. Jean nodded in agreement. Absolutely, that's what the Family Resource Center is for. But you know how some parents are, too proud to ask for help until they're backed into a corner. Pride. Ms. Crawford had seen it many times before. Parents who refused accommodations for learning disabilities, who insisted their children could succeed without modifications or support, who viewed any suggestion of assistance as an insult. Such pride often came at the expense of the child's best interests. Well, I've scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Mitchell for tomorrow afternoon, Ms. Crawford said. I'll make sure she understands the resources available and the importance of meeting. Classroom requirements. Good luck with that, Jan replied, standing to leave. Oh, and fair warning, I had Tyler Rodriguez's older brother 2 years ago. That family is a handful. Mother works 3 jobs, different schedule every week. The kids are basically raising themselves. After Jean left, Mrs. Crawford returned to her notes, adding the new information about Lucas's home situation. While she felt a twinge of sympathy for the boy's circumstances, she remained convinced of her pedagogical approach. The world didn't make accommodations for hardship. Better that children learn this lesson early in the supportive environment of school than face harsher consequences later in life. Her own childhood had been marked by similar challenges. Raised by a single father after her mother's death, she had learned self-reliance out of necessity. No one had lowered their expectations for Margaret Crawford. No one had offered special dispensations or exemptions from the rules, and she had thrived because of it, not despite it. The afternoon sun slanted through the classroom windows, illuminating the carefully labeled supply bins, the precisely arranged desks, the educational posters with their borders aligned to exact measurements, everything in its place, every system designed for optimal efficiency and clarity. This was the environment she had created, predictable, orderly, secure. The unexpected alliance she'd witnessed at lunch threatened that order. Zoe Anderson. Befriending Lucas Mitchell was concerning enough. The girl had leadership potential that Ms. Crawford had been cultivating since she'd identified it last spring during a classroom visit. Seeing her align herself with Tyler Rodriguez, whose disciplinary record suggested a troubling disregard for authority, was even more disturbing. Mrs. Crawford made another notation in her planner to create a new seating chart that would separate these students. Early intervention was key to maintaining classroom dynamics. She would place Lucas near the front where she could monitor his progress more closely, Tyler at the back corner where his disruptive potential could be minimized, and Zoe beside more suitable peers who would reinforce positive academic behaviors. Amina Hassan presented a different challenge. As an English language learner, she required additional support that Mrs. Crawford was, frankly, ill-equipped to provide with 23 other students demanding attention. The girl's quiet demeanor made her easy to overlook, which Ms. Crawford acknowledged was a professional shortcoming she needed to address. Perhaps placing Amina with Jackson Patel, whose patience and academic strength might provide good modeling, would be beneficial. A bell chimed over the intercom, signaling the end of the preparation period. Mrs. Crawford gathered her materials, mentally shifting from reflection to action. The afternoon would bring math assessments designed to establish baseline skills, followed by the distribution of classroom jobs and responsibilities. By tomorrow, normal routines would be established, and the disruption of the first morning would fade into the background of a well-structured school year, or so she thought. When her students filed back into the classroom after music class, Mrs. Crawford immediately noticed something different. The social groupings had shifted subtly. Lucas, still subdued but no longer actively trying to disappear, walked in alongside Tyler. Zoe entered with her usual group of girls, but immediately caught Lucas's eye and smiled. Amina, typically one of the last to enter, arrived promptly and took a seat near Lucas, rather than in her assigned spot. More concerning were the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when Mrs. Crawford approached, the folded notes she glimpsed being passed between unlikely pairs of students, the conspiratorial glances exchanged across the room. Something was happening beneath the surface of her carefully managed classroom, something she couldn't quite identify but instinctively recognized as a challenge to her authority. "Class," she said sharply, clapping her hands to gain attention. "Eyes forward. We have important work to do this afternoon." The students complied, their faces assuming expressions of attentive innocence that didn't quite mask the undercurrent of excitement humming through the room. Whatever was developing, Ms. Crawford determined to nip it in the bud. Tomorrow, with the new seating chart and after her meeting with Elena Mitchell, she would reassert the proper order. As she distributed the math assessment papers, Ms. Crawford paused at Lucas's desk. He had the borrowed pencil she'd given him that morning, but she also noticed a purple mechanical pencil with a unicorn eraser, partially concealed beneath his hand. Her eyes narrowed slightly at this unauthorized addition to his supplies, but she said nothing, making a mental note to address it later. What Margaret Crawford didn't realize, as she returned to the front of the classroom to begin the assessment instructions, was that the first threads of resistance had already been woven, invisible but strong, connecting student to student in a network of quiet solidarity that would soon challenge everything she thought she knew about authority, compassion, and the true meaning of educational values. Elena arrived at Pinewood Elementary 15 minutes early for her meeting with Mrs. Crawford, her waitress uniform partially concealed beneath a cardigan she kept in her car for occasions that required looking more professional. Darlene had covered the beginning of her shift so she could make this appointment, an act of kindness that Elena wasn't sure how she would repay. The school's front office was quiet in the late afternoon, most students having departed hours earlier. A secretary looked up from her computer as Elena entered. "I have a meeting with Ms. Crawford," Elena explained, trying to keep the nervousness from her voice. "I'm Lucas Mitchell's mother." "Of course," the secretary replied with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Ms. Crawford is expecting you. Her classroom is down the hall to the right, room 118. Elena followed the directions, her sensible work shoes squeaking slightly against the polished floor. The walls were lined with student artwork and motivational posters, bright splashes of color against institutional beige paint. Under different circumstances, she might have paused to look for Lucas's contributions, but anxiety propelled her forward. Room 118's door stood partially open. Elena knocked lightly, then stepped inside when a crisp voice invited her to enter. The classroom was meticulously organized with neatly labeled bins, color-coded folders, and educational displays covering nearly every available surface. At the teacher's desk sat a woman in her early 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed some papers. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming," Ms. Crawford said, rising to shake Elena's hand. Her grip was firm, her expression professionally neutral. "Please, have a seat." Elena sat in the chair indicated, an adult-sized one that had been placed beside the teacher's desk, rather than one of the small student chairs. A small mercy, at least. "I understand you wanted to discuss Lucas's supply situation," Elena began, wanting to take control of the conversation from the outset. "I've been making arrangements—" "Yes, that's part of what we need to discuss," Ms. Crawford interrupted, folding her hands on the desk. "But I'd also like to address Lucas's overall readiness for third grade. Yesterday's incident was concerning, not just because of the missing supplies, but because of Lucas's emotional response." Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks. "His emotional response to being publicly embarrassed, you mean?" If Mrs. Crawford registered the edge in Elena's voice, she didn't show it. "Children need to develop resilience, Ms. Mitchell. In the real world, they won't always have everything they need handed to them. Learning to handle disappointment and overcome obstacles is an essential life skill." The condescension in the teacher's tone made Elena's jaw tighten. She thought of Lucas's face that morning when she'd dropped him off for his second day. Anxious but determined, clutching the worn backpack Darlene had brought from her grandson. Inside were a few notebooks and pencils, not the complete list. By any means, but enough that he wouldn't face today empty-handed. "I agree that resilience is important," Elena said carefully. "But there's a difference between teaching children to overcome obstacles and humiliating them for circumstances beyond their control." Ms. Crawford's expression remained impassive. "I understand your family is experiencing financial difficulties," she said, the statement landing like a judgment rather than an expression of empathy. "Principal Garcia mentioned you've contacted our Family Resource Center. They can provide basic supplies for students in need, though typically these requests should be made before the school year begins." Elena took a deep breath, reminding herself that losing her temper wouldn't help Lucas. "My situation changed suddenly. I lost my job at Westbrook Technologies 2 months ago. I've been trying to find comparable work, but in the meantime, I've taken a position at Sunshine Diner to cover our basic expenses. School supplies were on my list, but electricity and rent took priority." For a moment, something like understanding flickered across Mrs. Crawford's face, quickly replaced by her professional mask. "These situations are challenging, certainly. However, as Lucas's teacher, my concern must be for his academic success. Coming to school unprepared affects not only his learning, but potentially disrupts the entire classroom environment." Before Elena could respond, there was a knock at the door. Principal Garcia entered, a folder in his hand and an apologetic smile on his face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I thought I should join this conversation." He extended his hand to Elena. "Ms. Mitchell, good to meet you in person. I'm James Garcia." Elena shook his hand, grateful for the interruption. Principal Garcia was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with a friendly demeanor. That contrasted sharply with Mrs. Crawford's rigidity. "Principal Garcia," Ms. Crawford acknowledged, her posture straightening slightly. "Ms. Mitchell and I were discussing Lucas's preparation for the school year." "Yes, I've been brought up to speed on the situation," the principal said, pulling up another chair. "Ms. Mitchell, first let me say that we're glad Lucas is part of our school community. Transitions like the one your family is experiencing can be difficult, and we want to support both you and Lucas through this time." His tone was warm and genuine, lacking the judgmental undertone that had colored Ms. Crawford's words. Elena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. "I'm doing my best to get Lucas what he needs. It's just been a challenging few months." Principal Garcia nodded understandingly. "We've put together some resources for you," he said, opening the folder he'd brought. "Our Family Resource Center can provide Lucas with the essential supplies on Mrs. Crawford's list. We also have information about community programs that might be helpful, job placement services, utility assistance, that sort of thing." "Amips." Crawford cleared her throat. "While these support services are valuable, I'm also concerned about Lucas's academic foundation. His records from second grade indicate he was performing at grade level, but not exceeding expectations in key areas. Without proper support and structure, he could fall behind." "Lucas is a bright boy," Elena said defensively. "His last teacher, Ms. Jackson, said he has a gift for creative writing and science. Ms. Jackson has a different teaching philosophy." "Then Mrs. Crawford," Principal Garcia acknowledged diplomatically. "Different teachers often observe different strengths in the same student." Elena heard the subtext clearly. Ms. Crawford's assessment of Lucas would likely focus on different metrics than his previous teachers. The realization was disheartening. Lucas had flourished under Ms. Jackson's nurturing approach, coming home excited about school projects and proud of his accomplishments. "What I'm suggesting," Ms. Crawford continued, "is that we implement a more structured approach for Lucas. Daily check-ins about homework completion, weekly progress reports sent home for your signature, perhaps enrollment in our after-school academic support program." The suggestions, framed as helpful interventions, felt like punishment to Elena, as if Lucas's lack of supplies indicated a deeper deficiency that required correction. "Is this something you recommend for all students?" she asked carefully. "Or just those whose parents can't afford new markers and binders?" Ms. Crawford's lips thinned at the implied accusation. "I recommend appropriate support based on individual student needs," Principal Garcia intervened smoothly. "What I think Ms. Crawford is suggesting is that we want to ensure Lucas doesn't experience additional stress during this challenging time. The transition to third grade involves more independent work and higher expectations. Extra support now might prevent difficulties later." Elena looked between the two educators, aware of the power dynamic at play. Principal Garcia seemed genuinely concerned for Lucas's welfare, but Mrs. Crawford was the one who would be with Lucas, every day shaping his experience in countless small ways. Antagonizing her wouldn't serve Lucas's interests. "I appreciate the school's support," Elena said finally. "The supplies will certainly help. As for the additional interventions, perhaps we could start with regular communication and reassess in a few weeks. Lucas has always been a responsible student. I'd like to give him the chance to prove that hasn't changed." Principal Garcia nodded, seeming relieved at this compromise. "That sounds reasonable, Ms. Crawford?" The teacher's expression remained neutral, but Elena sensed her disapproval. "Of course. We can begin with weekly email updates on Lucas's progress." As the meeting concluded and Elena gathered the resource materials Principal Garcia had provided, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd somehow failed Lucas again. She'd hoped to advocate more strongly, to make Mrs. Crawford understand the damage her public shaming had caused. Instead, she'd accepted a compromise that still framed Lucas as deficient, still put the burden on him to prove his worth in a system that had already judged him. Walking back to her car, Elena noticed a small group of children on the playground. An after-school program, perhaps? Among them, she spotted Lucas sitting on a bench with 3 other children, their heads bent together in conversation. As she watched, Lucas laughed at something one of them said, a genuine laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from him in weeks. Maybe school wouldn't be what she had hoped for him this year. Maybe Ms. Crawford would never see past her rigid expectations to recognize Lucas's unique gifts. But it seems Lucas arrived for his second day of third grade, clutching the backpack Darlene had given his mother, faded blue with a superhero logo that had mostly worn away, but still sturdy and functional. Inside were 3 notebooks, a package of pencils, and a small box of crayons. Not the full supply list by any means, but enough that he wouldn't face Mrs. Crawford empty-handed again. What Lucas didn't know was that Operation Backpack had expanded overnight. After school the previous day, Amina had discreetly delivered her folded notes to 5 carefully selected classmates. Olivia Chen, whose kind smile had given Lucas comfort, Kai Santos, whose family had immigrated from the Philippines the previous year, the twins Emma and Ethan Brooks, whose mother ran a stationery store, and surprisingly, Jackson Patel, who despite being perceived as a teacher's pet, had shown unexpected empathy during recess. All 5 had agreed to participate, won over by the conspiratorial thrill of a secret mission and the opportunity to subvert Mrs. Crawford's authority in a way that felt both rebellious and righteous. Overnight, Operation Backpack had grown from a small act of kindness into something approaching a movement. Mrs. Crawford greeted her students at the door as usual, clipboard in hand, checking off names as children entered. When Lucas approached, her eyes immediately went to his backpack. "Good morning, Lucas," she said, her tone neutral. "I see you have some supplies today." Lucas nodded, too nervous to speak. Behind him, Zoe caught his eye and gave him a discreet thumbs up. "I'll check them during morning routine," Ms. Crawford continued. "Please, take your seat. We have a new seating arrangement today." The news of a new seating chart was met with groans from several students. Changing seats on only the second day was unusual, even for Mrs. Crawford, who typically maintained the same arrangement for at least the first 2 weeks to establish routine. "The new chart is posted on the whiteboard," Ms. Crawford announced. "Please find your name and move your belongings to your new desk immediately." Students shuffled forward to examine the chart, then began relocating around the classroom with varying degrees of enthusiasm. It quickly became apparent that the new arrangement was strategic. Zoe had been moved to the front of the room, directly in Ms. Crawford's line of sight. Tyler was relegated to the back corner, as far from Lucas as possible. Amina remained near the middle, now seated beside Jackson Patel. And Lucas had been placed in the front row, isolated from all his newfound allies. "This is so unfair," Zoe whispered to Olivia as they passed each other in the shuffle. "She's trying to split us up." Olivia nodded in agreement. "Don't worry, we can still do the plan at recess." Ms. Crawford clapped her hands sharply. "Quickly and quietly, please. We have a busy morning ahead." Once everyone was settled, Ms. Crawford began the day with her usual efficiency. "Before we start our morning work, I'll be checking supplies again. Please place the items you have on your desk for inspection." Lucas's heart raced as he arranged his meager supplies, nowhere near the complete list, but surely better than yesterday. Ms. Crawford worked her way around the room, making notes on her clipboard as she examined each student's collection. When she reached Lucas, her expression remained carefully neutral. "I see you have notebooks and pencils now. That's an improvement. You're still missing quite a few items, though." She handed him a printed checklist with most items still unmarked. "Please have your mother review this. The Family Resource Center can help with the remaining supplies." Lucas nodded, relief washing over him as Ms. Crawford moved on without further comment. Across the room, he caught Tyler's eye, and the other boy gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The morning progressed with the usual routine of attendance, pledge of allegiance, and calendar activities. Mrs. Crawford then introduced the class's first writing assignment, a personal narrative about their summer vacation. "You'll need to complete a graphic organizer first," she explained, holding up a worksheet. "Then draft your narrative following the template provided. You'll need your green folder for this assignment." Lucas froze. He didn't have a green folder, or any folder for that matter. Just as panic began to rise in his chest, something slid onto his desk from behind. A green pocket folder, slightly used but in good condition. He turned to see Kai Santos quickly returning to his work, acting as if nothing had happened before. Lucas could process this. Mrs. Crawford's voice cut through his thoughts. "Lucas, is there a problem?" "No, Miss Crawford," he replied quickly, opening the folder and placing his worksheet inside. "I'm ready to start." Mrs. Crawford's eyes narrowed slightly at the green folder that hadn't been there during supplies check, but she said nothing and continued circulating around the room. Throughout the morning, similar small miracles occurred. When it was time for coloring, a pack of markers appeared on the corner of his desk, silently delivered by Emma Brooks as she walked to the pencil sharpener. During math, a ruler slid from Jackson's desk to Lucas's during a momentary distraction when Mrs. Crawford answered the classroom phone. Each time, the transfers happened so smoothly, so discreetly, that Ms. Crawford, despite her vigilance, caught only glimpses of movement, never enough to identify the source or purpose. Her growing frustration manifested in increasingly sharp reminders about classroom procedures and staying in assigned seats. By lunchtime, Lucas had accumulated a surprisingly complete collection of supplies, each item delivered with such careful coordination that it seemed almost magical. In the cafeteria, he found himself surrounded by a much larger group than the previous day. Not just Zoe, Tyler, and Amina, but also the 5 new recruits to Operation Backpack. "Did you see her face when you had that green folder?" Kai whispered, barely containing his laughter. She knew something was up, but couldn't figure out what. "The markers were the hardest," Emma confessed. "I thought for sure she'd catch me." Lucas looked around the table at these unexpected allies, a lump forming in his throat. "Thanks, you guys. Seriously?" Zoe beamed at him. "We're not done yet. There's still like half the list to go. And we have more people wanting to help now," Amina added. Megan asked me at music if she could join. Tyler snorted in disbelief. Megan? No way. She's just trying to find out what we're doing, so she can tell Crawford. I don't think so, Olivia defended. She seemed really sorry about yesterday, said she didn't realize how mean Crawford was being until she thought about it more. Their plotting was interrupted by the arrival of Ms. Crawford. At their table, her presence casting an immediate chill over the conversation. This is quite the gathering, she observed, her gaze sweeping across the unexpectedly diverse social group. I don't believe I've ever seen the 10 of you sitting together before. We're friends now, Zoe stated matter-of-factly, echoing her declaration from the previous day, but with even greater conviction. Ms. Crawford's smile didn't reach her eyes. How nice, though I do wonder what you all suddenly have in common. We like each other, Kai replied with a shrug, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. For a moment, Ms. Crawford seemed at a loss for words, unused to such direct challenges to her authority, especially from students who typically followed the rules without question. Well, she said finally, lunch period ends in 5 minutes. Don't be late returning to class. As she walked away, the children exchanged triumphant glances. It was a small victory, but significant. They had united in a common cause and stood firm against an authority figure who had always seemed untouchable. We need to be more careful this afternoon, Jackson warned, once Mrs. Crawford was out of earshot. She's watching us now. We can pass things between classes, Ethan suggested, or during bathroom breaks. Or we could just give everything at once, Tyler proposed, like all together so she can't stop it. This bold suggestion was met with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Direct confrontation with Mrs. Crawford was intimidating, even with safety in numbers. Let's see how the afternoon goes, Zoe decided, naturally assuming a leadership role that no one contested. If we can keep doing it secretly, great. If not, we'll think of something else. As they returned to class, Lucas felt a strange new sensation, a lightness in his chest, a straightening of his shoulders. Yesterday he had been the boy with nothing, the object of pity or judgment. Today he was the center of something important, something that had brought together students who might never have spoken to each other otherwise. Mrs. Crawford was waiting as they filed back into the classroom, her posture rigid, her expression vigilant. She might have rearranged their seats, but she couldn't control the bonds that had formed between them. Somehow her attempt to isolate Lucas had instead created a network of connection that spanned the entire classroom. The afternoon promised to be a silent battle of wills, Ms. Crawford's authority against the children's solidarity. As Lucas took his seat, surrounded by his growing collection of secretly delivered supplies, he realized with surprise that for the first time since entering room 118, he wasn't afraid of what would happen next. News of what was happening in Mrs. Crawford's third-grade classroom spread through Pinewood Elementary with remarkable speed. At morning recess, younger siblings heard stories from their third-grade brothers and sisters. During lunch, cafeteria, monitors noticed the unusual social groupings forming around Lucas. By afternoon dismissal, teachers were discussing the situation in hushed tones in the faculty lounge. Crawford's on the warpath, reported Mr. Dennis, the music teacher, as he poured himself a cup of coffee. I've never seen her so rattled. The kids were practically mutinous during music appreciation today. Ms. Thompson, the fourth-grade teacher, and Ms. Crawford's longtime ally, shook her head disapprovingly. It's that Mitchell boy, the one with Pam. No supplies. Apparently, the other children have been smuggling items to him all day. Margaret said it's like they've formed some sort of underground resistance movement. Good for them, muttered Mrs. Chen, a second-grade teacher who had often clashed with Ms. Crawford over pedagogical approaches. Maybe Margaret will finally realize that public humiliation isn't an effective teaching strategy. Principal Garcia, entering the lounge in time to hear this last comment, frowned slightly. Let's keep our discussions professional, please. I'm meeting with Margaret after school to discuss the situation. By dismissal time, parents waiting in the pickup line had caught wind of the developing drama. Information traveled from child to parent, parent to parent, creating a ripple effect of reactions throughout the school community. Apparently, Mrs. Crawford made some poor child cry because he didn't have the right supplies, Lisa Anderson told the group of mothers gathered near Herdfewth. As Zoe's mother and the president of the PTA, her words carried particular weight. Zoe was quite upset about it. She said the boy's mother lost her job recently. Patricia Rodriguez, Tyler's mother and a member of the school board, listened with growing concern. Tyler rarely spoke about school, and when he did, it was usually in response to direct questioning. But this morning, he had voluntarily mentioned something about helping a kid in his class who was being treated unfairly. Did Crawford call the parents? Patricia asked. Offer resources. The school has programs for exactly this situation. Lisa shrugged. According to Zoe, she just humiliated the boy in front of everyone. My daughter came home and immediately packed up extra supplies to bring today. Across the parking lot, Elena Mitchell arrived for pickup, having managed to swap shifts, with Darlene again to be there when Lucas got out of school. She felt conspicuous in her waitress uniform, aware of the glances from other parents in their business attire and casual designer clothes. Spotting Mrs. Alvarez, who normally watched Lucas after school, Elena approached the elderly woman with an apologetic smile. Thanks for understanding about the schedule change, Elena said. I should be back to normal hours tomorrow. Mrs. Alvarez patted her arm kindly. No problem, dear. How did your meeting go with the teacher? Elena hesitated, unsure how much to share. It was complicated. The principal seemed supportive, but Lucas's teacher is very focused on rules and structure. Ah, Miss Crawford, Mrs. Alvarez nodded knowingly. My granddaughter had her 3 years ago. Very strict, that one. Old school. Before Elena could respond, the dismissal bell rang and children began pouring out of the building. She scanned the crowd for Lucas, worrying about how his day had gone after yesterday's humiliation and her meeting with Mrs. Crawford. When she finally spotted him, Elena was surprised to see him surrounded by a group of children, not walking alone as she had expected. Even more surprising was his expression, animated, almost happy, a stark contrast to his defeated posture the previous afternoon. Mom, Lucas called when he saw her, breaking away from the group and hurrying toward her with his backpack bouncing against his back, the same worn backpack Darlene had provided, but now apparently much fuller than it had been that morning. Hey, mijo, Elena greeted him, bending to hug him. How was school today? It was... Lucas glanced back at the group of children who were watching with obvious interest. It was different. Better. He lowered his voice. I need to tell you something, but not here. Elena nodded, curiosity mingling with concern. Okay, we can talk in the car. As they turned to leave, a petite woman with carefully styled blonde hair approached them, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head. Excuse me, she said warmly. You must be Lucas's mom. I'm Lisa Anderson, Zoe's mother. She extended a manicured hand, which Elena shook somewhat warily. Elena Mitchell, she responded. Nice to meet you. Zoe has told me about what happened yesterday, Lisa continued, her voice lowered discreetly. I just wanted to say that if there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. We have plenty of extra supplies at home. Elena felt her defenses rise automatically, pride wrestling with practicality. That's very kind, but... Mom, Lucas interrupted, tugging at her sleeve. Zoe's really nice. She helped me. Something in Lucas's earnest expression made Elena reconsider her instinctive rejection of help. Thank you, she said to Lisa. That's very generous. It's nothing, really, Lisa assured her. And listen, we're having a small get-together this weekend, just a few families from class. Swimming and barbecue. We'd love for you and Lucas to join us. Before Elena could formulate a response to this unexpected invitation, another woman approached, younger, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in scrubs that suggested she'd come directly from a medical job. Patricia Rodriguez, she introduced herself, Tyler's mom, also on the school board. Her direct manner matched her appearance. Efficient, no nonsense. I heard about what happened with Ms. Crawford. Totally unacceptable. I'll be raising it at the next board meeting. Elena felt suddenly overwhelmed by this flurry of parental attention. Yesterday, she had been invisible, just another struggling single mother trying to keep her head above water. Today, she was the center of a rapidly forming community response. I appreciate your concern, she managed, but I don't want to cause trouble. Patricia's expression softened slightly. It's not about causing trouble. It's about making sure all kids are treated with dignity. Tyler says Lucas is a good kid. That's enough for me. As more parents approached, drawn by the growing conversation, Lucas tugged again at Elena's sleeve. "Can we go now?" he whispered, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "Of course." Elena nodded, then addressed the small group that had formed. "Thank you all, really, but we need to get going." In the car, Lucas finally opened his backpack, revealing a collection of school supplies that far exceeded what Elena had sent him with that morning. Notebooks in various colors, folders, markers, colored pencils, glue sticks, scissors. Item after item emerged from the bag. "Where did all this come from?" Elena asked, astonished. Lucas explained Operation Backpack in detail, how Zoe, Tyler, and Amina had first befriended him, how they had recruited others to help, how they had smuggled supplies to him throughout the day, despite Mrs. Crawford's attempts to stop them. "Everyone helped, Mom," he concluded, his voice filled with wonder. "Even Jackson, and he never breaks rules. And now Miss Crawford is really mad, but she can't figure out how to stop it." Elena listened, emotions battling within her, gratitude for the children's kindness, pride in Lucas for finding his place, concern about potential repercussions from an angered Mrs. Crawford. "That was very kind of your classmates," she said carefully. "But I don't want you getting in trouble." Lucas shook his head firmly. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're just helping each other. That's what Ms. Jackson always taught us last. Here, that a classroom is a community where everyone supports everyone else." The conviction in his voice caught Elena by surprise. This was a side of Lucas she hadn't seen in months, since before the layoff, before the financial stress had cast its shadow over their lives. Somehow, in the midst of what should have been a humiliating experience, her son had found his voice. As they drove home, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. At a stoplight, she checked it quickly. "Hi, Elena. This is Lisa Anderson, Zoe's mom. Got your number from school directory. Wanted to make sure you have details for Saturday's gathering. Also, several parents are meeting tomorrow to discuss situation with Ms. Crawford. Would value your input. No pressure," followed immediately by another text. "This is Patricia Rodriguez. School board meeting next Thursday. Plan to address Crawford's situation. Your presence would strengthen case. Can arrange childcare if needed." Elena set the phone down, overwhelmed by the rapid escalation. What had begun as a private humiliation for Lucas had somehow transformed into a community issue, with parents taking sides, teachers discussing it in the lounge, and even the school board potentially becoming involved. "Mom?" Lucas asked, noticing her expression. "Is everything okay?" Elena reached over to squeeze his hand. "Yes, mijo, I think maybe it is. Things are changing." As they pulled into their apartment complex, Elena realized that for the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone in facing the challenges before them. Unexpected allies had emerged, not just for Lucas, but perhaps for her as well. Whether this would ultimately make things better or more complicated remained to be seen, but the solidarity shown by Lucas's classmates had created a ripple effect that continued. Margaret Crawford had been teaching long enough to recognize when a situation was slipping beyond her control. As she sat in Principal Garcia's office after school, watching him review the emails from concerned parents that had flooded his inbox, she maintained her composed exterior while inwardly acknowledging that the events of the past 2 days had escalated far beyond what she had anticipated. "For 7 emails since dismissal, Margaret," Principal Garcia said, looking up from his computer screen. "7 parents expressing concern about how Lucas Mitchell was treated in your classroom. That's nearly a third of your class. Children often exaggerate or misinterpret classroom management strategies when reporting to their parents," Ms. Crawford replied evenly. "I was simply enforcing established expectations." Principal Garcia removed his glasses, a gesture Mrs. Crawford had come to recognize as a prelude to a difficult conversation. The accounts are remarkably consistent, publicly pointing out Lucas's lack of supplies, using him as a negative example. For the class, separating him from supportive peers with a new seating chart on the second day. "I create seating charts based on optimal learning environments," Ms. Crawford interrupted. "Tyler Rodriguez has a history of behavioral issues. Zoe Anderson is easily distracted by social interactions. These are documented concerns." "Margaret," Principal Garcia's voice was gentle but firm, "I understand your commitment to structure and high standards. It's made you an effective teacher in many ways, but in this case, your approach has created a situation that's dividing our school community." He turned his computer screen to show her an email. "Patricia Rodriguez is on the school board, Margaret. She's formally requesting that we review your handling of this situation at next week's meeting." Ms. Crawford felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Patricia Rodriguez was known for her direct approach and unwavering advocacy for students. Having her attention focused on this incident was concerning. "James," Ms. Crawford said, using the principal's first name to emphasize their collegial relationship, "I've been teaching at Pinewood for 25 years. My methods may be traditional, but my results speak for themselves. Test scores, college admissions rates—" "This isn't about test scores," Principal Garcia interrupted. "It's about a child who was humiliated for circumstances beyond his control, and about a classroom of 8-year-olds who recognized the injustice before the adult in the room did." The bluntness of his assessment stung. Mrs. Crawford straightened, in her chair, professional pride rising to her defense. "Children need to learn that the world has expectations, that actions, or lack of preparation, have consequences." "And what lesson did Lucas learn from this experience?" Principal Garcia asked. "That asking for help is shameful, that his worth as a student is measured by whether his family can afford the right supplies." "That wasn't my intention," Ms. Crawford insisted, though a flicker of doubt had begun to penetrate her certainty. Principal Garcia sighed, replacing his glasses. "Intentions and impacts are different things, Margaret. Whatever your intention, the impact has been significant on Lucas, on your class, and now on our broader school community." He handed her a folder containing printed copies of the parent emails. "I'd like you to review these, really consider the perspective of these families. Then tomorrow, we need to discuss how to move forward constructively." Ms. Crawford accepted the folder with a stiff nod. "Of course. Is that all?" "One more thing," Principal Garcia added as she stood to leave. "I received a call from Elena Mitchell this afternoon. Despite everything, she specifically asked that we work toward a positive resolution. She doesn't want this incident to define Lucas's relationship with you or the school. I found that remarkably gracious, given the circumstances." The principal's words followed Mrs. Crawford as she walked back to her empty classroom. Gracious was not a word she would have associated with a parent who failed to provide basic school supplies. And yet, Elena Mitchell had apparently chosen reconciliation over recrimination, a choice that contradicted Mrs. Crawford's assumptions about her. The classroom looked different somehow in the late afternoon light, less like the orderly domain she controlled and more like an empty stage where the day's drama had played out. She moved between the desks, recalling the covert passing of supplies, the whispered conversations that ceased when she approached, the unexpected alliances that had formed in defiance of her authority. On Lucas's desk, she found a small construction paper card that must have been left after dismissal. Opening it, she read the childish handwriting inside. "Welcome to 3rd grade, Lucas, from your friends." It was signed by 14 students, more than half the class, with small drawings and messages surrounding their names. Ms. Crawford sat heavily in her chair, the card still in her hand. In 25 years of teaching, she had prided herself on maintaining control, on creating an environment where expectations were clear and consequences were consistent. Had she become so focused on order that she'd lost sight of compassion, so committed to standards that she'd forgotten the children behind them? At home that evening, Mrs. Crawford did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She questioned her methods. Seated at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, she opened the folder Principal Garcia had given her and began to read. From Lisa Anderson. "My daughter came home in tears over how Lucas was treated. Zoe has always loved school, but yesterday she said she was disappointed in you. Children notice when adults aren't fair." From Patricia Rodriguez. "As a school board member and Tyler's mother, I'm deeply concerned about the message being sent to students about economic privilege and educational access. Tyler, who has struggled to connect with school, came home passionate about helping a classmate. That speaks volumes." From David and Sarah Brooks, parents of the twins. "Emma and Ethan have been taught that kindness matters above all else. We're proud they stood up for their classmate, but troubled they felt they needed to do so secretly." Each letter expressed similar sentiments: concern for Lucas, pride in their own children's response, and disappointment in Mrs. Crawford's handling of the situation. There was no self-righteous condemnation, no threatening language, just genuine concern from parents who wanted their children to learn in an environment that valued both academic achievement and basic human dignity. The last email in the stack was from Kai Santos's father. "In our culture, we believe that how we treat those with less than us defines our character. My son said he gave Lucas a folder and felt like a hero. Thank you for creating an opportunity for him to learn this important lesson, though perhaps not in the way you intended." Ms. Crawford set the letters down, unsettled by the perspectives they represented. Throughout her career, she had received occasional complaints from parents who thought she was too strict, too demanding, too old-fashioned. She had always dismissed these as coming from those who didn't understand the importance of high standards and clear boundaries. But these letters were different. They didn't question her academic rigor or classroom management in general. They specifically challenged her treatment of one vulnerable child, and by extension, her fundamental values as an educator as she prepared for bed that night. Mrs. Crawford found herself remembering her own childhood, the carefully maintained facade of normalcy her father had insisted upon after her mother's death, the second-hand clothes precisely ironed, the recycled school supplies carefully disguised. She had learned early that appearing prepared was nearly as important as being prepared, that meeting external expectations was the path to acceptance and advancement. Had she internalized those lessons so completely that she now imposed them on children like Lucas? Had her own experiences hardened rather than sensitized her to the struggles of others? Sleep eluded her as these uncomfortable questions circled in her mind. By morning, Margaret Crawford had not arrived at any definitive answers, but she had reached one important conclusion. Tomorrow would need to be different. Somehow she would need to find a way forward that maintained her standards while acknowledging the legitimate concerns raised by the school community. What that would look like, she wasn't entirely sure. In 25 years of teaching, Ms. Crawford had rarely admitted error or changed course mid-year. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, one thought provided unexpected comfort. Her students, in their innocent wisdom, had already shown her that it was possible to maintain principles while still showing compassion. Perhaps she had something to learn from them after all. Lucas woke up on Thursday morning with an unfamiliar feeling in his chest. A lightness, a quiet excitement about going to school. After brushing his teeth, he carefully arranged his new supplies in the backpack, still amazed by how his classmates had rallied around him. Yesterday had been even more remarkable than Tuesday, with additional items appearing mysteriously on his desk throughout the day. A set of highlighters from Megan, a pencil case from Ethan, even a calculator from Jackson. In the kitchen, Elena was already up making pancakes despite the early hour, a special treat they usually reserved for weekends or birthdays. "What's the occasion?" Lucas asked, sliding onto a chair at their small table. Elena flipped a pancake with practiced skill. "Just felt like celebrating a little," she said, smiling over her shoulder. "Things are looking up, don't you think?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically. "Definitely. And guess what? Kai told me his mom wants to know if I can come over after school sometime. They have a new video game he thinks I'd like." Elena set a plate of pancakes in front of him. "That sounds fun. Maybe next week, once things settle down a bit." She hesitated, then added, "I got a call from the Family Resource Center yesterday. They have a backpack for you with some more supplies. We can pick it up after school today." Lucas paused mid-bite. "But I already have supplies now. My friends gave me everything I need." "I know, mijo, and that was incredibly kind of them, but these supplies are specifically set aside for students who need them. It's part of what our school taxes pay for. It's not charity, it's just the school community taking care of its own." Lucas considered this, remembering Amina's words. Everyone needs help sometimes, no shame. Finally, he nodded. "Okay. But can I still keep the stuff from my friends?" "Too? Of course," Elena assured him. "Those were gifts given with love." Across town, in a spacious house on Pinewood's north side, Zoe Anderson sat at the breakfast bar while her mother made calls on her cell phone, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. "Yes, 4 o'clock works perfectly," Lisa said into the mom phone. "My house, I'll send you the address," and Patricia confirmed she'll be there directly from her shift at the hospital. She glanced at Zoe and mouthed, "Almost done," before turning her attention back to the call. "Wonderful, see you then." Hanging up, Lisa turned to her daughter. "That was Kai's mom. She'll be joining us this afternoon along with Lucas's mom and a few others." Zoe munched her cereal thoughtfully. "What exactly are you guys planning?" Lisa smiled. "Just a conversation about how to make sure all students at Pinewood feel supported. Sometimes adults need to step in when things aren't right, like how Ms. Crawford treated Lucas," Zoe asked. "Exactly like that," Lisa confirmed. "Speaking of which, do you think Lucas would enjoy coming to our pool party on Saturday?" "You mentioned inviting him," Zoe nodded enthusiastically. "Definitely, though," she hesitated, a thought occurring to her. "He might not have swim trunks, or maybe he doesn't know how to swim." "I didn't think of that." Lisa regarded her daughter with pride. Just a week ago, Zoe might not have considered such practical concerns about a classmate's circumstances. "That's thoughtful of you to consider." "I'll mention it to his mom this afternoon, see if there's anything we can do to make him comfortable." In yet another household, Tyler Rodriguez sat on his front steps, waiting for his ride to school. His mother had already left for her early hospital shift, leaving him a lunch bag in the refrigerator and a note reminding him that Mrs. Diaz next door would pick him up in her carpool. Tyler wasn't worried about being forgotten. The routine was well established, and Mrs. Diaz had never once been late in 2 years of driving him to school. What occupied Tyler's thoughts this morning was the strange new respect he'd noticed from his classmates yesterday. Kids who normally avoided him, wary of his reputation for outbursts and trips to the principal's office, had approached him between classes to ask about Operation Backpack. Even Mr. Dennis, the music teacher, who usually watched Tyler like a hawk, had given him an approving nod when he helped Lucas find the right page in the songbook. It was weird, this feeling of being seen for something positive. Weird, but not bad. Mrs. Diaz's minivan pulled up and Tyler grabbed his backpack. Sliding into the back seat beside her son Miguel, a 4th grader, Tyler was surprised when Miguel greeted him with unusual enthusiasm. "Dude, is it true you guys basically started a revolution in Crawford's class?" Miguel asked. eyes wide with admiration, because that's what everyone's saying. Tyler shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant despite the warm glow of pride spreading through his chest. It wasn't just me. It was Zoe's idea first, and Amina named it Operation Backpack. We all just wanted to help Lucas. Still, Miguel insisted. It's pretty cool, standing up to Crawford like that. She's terrifying. As the van filled with other neighborhood children, Tyler found himself at the center of attention, fielding questions about the revolution. In room 118, by the time they reached Pinewood Elementary, Tyler had warmed to his role as reluctant revolutionary, though he was careful to emphasize that it had been a group effort. We just did what was right, he explained as they walked toward the building. Crawford was being unfair, so we fixed it. The simplicity of this moral calculus, identifying injustice and taking action to correct it, felt clarifying to Tyler. School rules had often seemed arbitrary and confusing, designed to trip him up rather than help him succeed. But this situation had presented a clear right and wrong, and for once Tyler had found himself firmly on the right side. Inside the school, an unusual energy permeated the hallways. Teachers spoke in hushed tones as students passed, discussions, pausing and resuming in a pattern that suggested the adults were talking about the children rather than the other way around. Principal Garcia was visible in the main corridor, greeting students with particular warmth while maintaining a watchful eye on the overall atmosphere. In room 118, students arrived to find Ms. Crawford already at her desk rather than at the door checking them in as usual. The change in routine was subtle, but immediately noticed by children attuned to the precise patterns of their school day. They filed in quietly, exchanging curious glances as they took their seats according to yesterday's new arrangement. Lucas entered with Kai and Olivia, the three deep in conversation about a book they had discovered they all enjoyed. He took his isolated front row seat without complaint, offering a small smile to Zoe across the room. His desk now contained a nearly complete set of supplies, each item representing a small act of solidarity from a classmate. When the bell rang, Mrs. Crawford stood and moved to the front of the room. The students fell silent, noting something different in their teacher's demeanor. A slight hesitation, a softening around her usually rigid posture. "Good morning, class," she began, her voice steady but lacking its usual authoritative edge. "Before we start our day, I'd like to say something." The children watched with rapt attention, sensing the unusual nature of this moment. Mrs. Crawford rarely deviated from her structured routine, and she almost never began the day with unplanned remarks. "It has come to my attention," she continued, "that there has been some confusion about our classroom supply requirements and the way we support each other as a learning community." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "While it's important to come prepared for learning, it's equally important that we recognize that each family's circumstances are different, and that sometimes students may need support in ways that aren't immediately visible." The classroom remained utterly silent, children barely breathing as they witnessed something none of them had expected. Ms. Crawford acknowledging, however, indirectly, that her approach might have been flawed. "Moving forward," she continued, "I want to clarify that our classroom will maintain a supply cabinet for anyone who needs to borrow or use items. No questions asked. And," here she hesitated again, the words clearly difficult for her, "I want to commend those of you who recognized a classmate in need and took initiative to help. That shows character and compassion." Across the room, Zoe and Tyler exchanged stunned glances. Amina's eyes widened in surprise, and Lucas, seated directly in Mrs. Crawford's line of sight, straightened slightly in his chair, a cautious hope visible in his expression. "Now," Miss Crawford concluded, visibly shifting back toward her more familiar professional persona, "let's begin our morning routine. Lucas, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance today?" As Lucas stood and moved to the front of the room, a small but significant honor in their classroom hierarchy, The energy in room 118 shifted once again. Something had changed. Not completely, not permanently perhaps, but meaningfully. A small crack had appeared in Mrs. Crawford's rigid facade, allowing a glimpse of the more complex human beneath the authoritarian teacher persona. Whether this change would last remained to be seen. But as Lucas led his classmates in the familiar words of the pledge, standing a little taller than he had just days before, one thing was certain. The children of room 118 had discovered their collective power, and that discovery would continue to reshape their relationships with each other, with their teacher, and with the very concept of justice itself. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Elena Mitchell walked Lucas to his classroom, carrying a large tote bag filled with cookies for the class holiday party. Her new office job at Anderson Real Estate, a position Lisa had helped, her secure after learning of Elena's administrative background, meant she could now occasionally volunteer during school hours, a luxury that would have been impossible during her waitressing days. "Remember, Mom," Lucas reminded her as they approached room 118, "Ms. Crawford doesn't like when parents are late to classroom events." Elena smiled at her son's earnest expression. "Don't worry, we're 10 minutes early." The classroom had transformed. Since that first week of September, not just in the seasonal decorations that now adorned the walls, but in its fundamental atmosphere. The rigid rows of desks had been replaced by collaborative table groups, a change that had occurred gradually over the past months as Mrs. Crawford cautiously implemented suggestions from her professional development sessions with Principal Garcia. The center table sat Lucas with his now established friend group, Zoe, Tyler, Amina, and Kai. They were bent over a science project involving circuit boards, their excited voices carrying across the room as they tested different configurations. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," Mrs. Crawford greeted from her desk, where she was organizing materials for the day's activities. Her tone was polite, professional, not warm exactly, but no longer cold. Progress of a sort. "Good morning," Elena replied, setting the cookies on the designated refreshment table. "Where would you like me to help first?" "The craft station needs setup, if you wouldn't mind," Ms. Crawford directed. Mrs. Anderson and Mrs. Santos should be arriving shortly to help as well, as Elena arranged materials for the holiday ornament-making activity. She observed the easy camaraderie among the students arriving for the day. Lucas moved confidently through the room, stopping to chat with classmates, offering help to Emma Brooks with her science notebook, completely at home in this space that had once been the site of his humiliation, the parent-teacher conference. In October had revealed a Lucas that Elena barely recognized from previous school reports, engaged, contributing actively to class discussions, showing leadership potential in group projects. Ms. Crawford had delivered this assessment with her usual precision, but there had been a new note in her voice when she described Lucas's progress, something almost like pride. "He's quite remarkable," she had concluded, "resilient, compassionate, and increasingly confident academically. You should be very proud." Elena had been proud, of course, but also grateful for the unexpected community that had formed around them. In the aftermath of that difficult first day, the Anderson family's pool party had become a regular weekend gathering spot. Tyler's mother, Patricia, had connected Elena with resources for career development. Kai's parents had included Lucas in their family camping trips, and Amina's mother had started a weekly homework club that rotated between homes, ensuring all children had access to support regardless of their parents' work schedules. "The cookies look delicious," said Lisa Anderson, appearing beside Elena at the craft table. "Homemade?" Elena laughed. "Store-bought, but transferred to a nice container. Some of us are still working on our domestic skills." "Smart woman," Lisa approved. "I stayed up until midnight finishing these ridiculous ornament kits. Next year, I'm buying them pre-assembled." Their easy conversation would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. The polished real estate mogul's wife and the struggling single mother now operating as peers, their children's friendship having bridged gaps of circumstance and experience that might otherwise have kept them in separate social spheres. Across the room, Mrs. Crawford clapped her hands for attention. "Please finish what you're working on and come to the meeting area," she announced. "Before our party begins, we have something important to discuss." The children quickly tidied their areas and gathered on the colorful rug that had been added to the classroom in October, another change in Miss Crawford's formerly stark educational environment. Parents took positions around the perimeter, curious about this unscheduled announcement. "As you know," Ms. Crawford began, once everyone was settled, "our classroom community project for December was to identify a need in our school and develop a solution. You've all been working in groups on your proposals, and today we were going to vote on which one to implement." She paused, adjusting her glasses. A habitual gesture that now seemed less about maintaining authority and more about gathering thoughts. "However, the school administration has informed me that they've already selected one proposal for immediate implementation. Mr. Garcia, would you like to explain?" Principal Garcia stepped into the classroom, smiling warmly at the assembled students and parents. "Thank you, Ms. Crawford. Good morning, everyone. I'm here because one of your project ideas so impressed our administrative team that we've decided to implement it school-wide, starting in January." He held up a folder with "Classroom Community Cupboard" written on the cover in colorful letters. This proposal, created by Lucas, Zoe, Tyler, Amina, and Kai, suggests that every classroom maintain a supply cabinet that any student can access anonymously when needed. Additionally, it recommends a system where families can donate extra supplies throughout the year, ensuring that the cupboards remain stocked. Lucas's eyes widened in surprise as Principal Garcia continued. "What particularly impressed us was the thoughtfulness of the implementation plan. The suggestion that these cupboards be available to everyone, not just students identified as in need, removes any stigma from their use. And the proposed supply swap events, where students can exchange items they don't need for ones they do, promotes both sustainability and community." Pride radiated from Elena as she watched Lucas and his friends exchange excited glances, their months of quiet resistance and solidarity now transformed into official school policy. Furthermore, Principal Garcia added, "The school board, led by Mrs. Rodriguez," he nodded toward Tyler's mother standing near the door, "has approved funding to establish these community cupboards in every classroom at Pinewood Elementary. They've also revised our school supply policy to emphasize that while we provide lists as guidance, all essential educational materials will be available to any student who needs them. No questions asked." A ripple of approving murmurs moved through the parent observers. Ms. Crawford's expression remained composed, though Elena thought she detected a slight softening around her eyes. The closest thing to emotion the teacher typically displayed in professional settings. After Principal Garcia departed and the holiday party commenced in earnest, Elena found herself helping at the ornament station alongside Mrs. Crawford, an unexpected pairing that might once have been tense but now felt merely slightly awkward. "Lucas has really thrived these past months," Elena commented, as they distributed glitter and glue to excited third graders. Ms. Crawford nodded, carefully wiping glitter from her hands. "He has indeed. He shows considerable leadership potential." Pause, then the teacher added something unexpected. "I believe I owe you an apology, Ms. Mitchell." Helena looked up in surprise. "Oh? My approach at the beginning of the year was overly rigid. I made assumptions about Lucas and about you that were unfair and ultimately incorrect." The words seemed difficult for Ms. Crawford, but she continued with characteristic precision. "In 26 years of teaching, I've rarely been so thoroughly schooled by my students. It's been a humbling experience." Elena considered her response carefully. "We all have our moments of learning," she said finally. "Lucas taught me something important too, that asking for help isn't weakness, it's how communities are built." Ms. Crawford allowed herself a small smile. "Indeed, your son and his friends have quite effectively restructured the social dynamics of this entire school." I suspect they'll continue to challenge our systems as they grow up. The world needs more of that kind of constructive disruption. Across the room, Lucas was helping a younger sibling visiting for the party create a snowflake ornament, his patient guidance reflecting a confidence that had blossomed over the past months. He caught Elena's eye and waved, his smile bright and uninhibited. 3 months ago, Lucas had entered this classroom feeling less than, marked by his family's financial circumstances, shrinking beneath the weight of shame. Today he moved through the same space as a leader, his worth recognized not by the supplies he possessed, but by the character he had demonstrated. The classroom community cupboard would soon be installed in room 118 and throughout Pinewood Elementary, a physical reminder of the change one small act of injustice and the resulting wave of resistance had created. But the more significant transformation had already occurred within the hearts and minds of everyone involved. Children who had discovered their collective power, parents who had built bridges across social divides, and even a veteran teacher who had found the courage to question long-held beliefs. As the party continued around her, Elena watched Lucas with his friends, Zoe showing off her perfectly symmetrical snowflake, Tyler adding excessive glitter to everything within reach, Amina precisely following the instructions, Kai creating an entirely original design. Different approaches, different personalities, united by the simple understanding that